A passenger kicked a baby's toy and provoked a teen, but when the pilot intervened, the cabin watched in stunned silence as justice unfolded. A passenger kicked the baby's toy, thinking no one would stop him. Then he kicked the teen, confident he was untouchable. He didn't realize the pilot was just behind him, ready to deliver a fist that would shift the entire cabin's balance. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority steps in. The toy hit the floor with a soft clink, rolling forward with tiny wooden thuds beneath the seats. It stopped just short of the next row, near the polished black shoes of a man who hadn't smiled once since boarding. Corbin Hale. He stared at the toy like it was an insult. Not a harmless child's object, but a personal offense aimed directly at him. Without a word, and without even bending to pick it up, he drew back his foot and kicked it, hard. The wooden planet slammed against the opposite aisle wall with a loud thunk, bouncing once before wobbling to a stop near a steward's cart. Jalen Verdun flinched. Seated directly in front of the man, he had just been reaching for the toy when the sharp kick sent it flying. His baby brother, LaRon, blinked in confusion, his chubby hands now empty, his mouth forming a soft pout that trembled with the beginning of a cry. Across the aisle, Derek Verdun's eyes lifted from the document binder in his lap. His gaze locked on Corbin with the silent authority of a man used to logistics, timing, and quiet control. But he said nothing yet. Jalen reached slowly into the aisle, heart thudding louder than the engines outside. As he extended his hand toward the toy, he felt the air shift again. "Teach your kid to keep his trash to himself," Corbin muttered, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. But just loud enough for Jalen. The words slid under Jalen's skin like splinters. He paused mid-reach, his fingers trembling above the wooden toy. His mind wrestled with the insult, the tension growing inside his chest. At 17, he wasn't easily provoked, but this felt different. His job on this flight was to protect his baby brother, not start fights. But wasn't this already one? He picked up the toy without replying, placing it gently back in LaRon's lap. The baby cooed quietly, unaware of the storm tightening around them. Behind them, Corbin leaned back in his seat with an exaggerated sigh, muttering again under his breath, this time unintelligibly. But his tone oozed contempt. Jalen's neck stiffened. He kept his eyes forward, gripping the armrest tighter. Derek caught the motion from across the aisle. With a slight nod and a glance that spoke volumes, he reminded his son of the promise made just before boarding. Let nothing ruin this flight. Jalen nodded faintly, trying to steady himself. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane rose through a thin stretch of early morning cloud. Outside, the sun was just a hint of gold along the edge of the wing. Inside, the atmosphere was already heavy. Most passengers were still settling in, oblivious to what had just happened in row 14. To them, Corbin was just another tired traveler muttering about delays. But to Jalen, there was already a dangerous rhythm in the air, a warning he couldn't explain, like something waiting to ignite. Corbin, despite appearing uninterested, watched them both. He scanned the father, then the boy, then the baby. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes tightened. LaRon tapped the toy gently against the tray table, the soft wooden sound filling the silence between rows, the same sound that had calmed him through every stressful trip. Corbin's lips curled almost imperceptibly. Jalen sensed it before it happened, just a flicker in his peripheral vision. He turned slightly, and Corbin's eyes met his for the briefest moment. Cold, calculating, as if daring him to say something. Jalen swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't know why this man had chosen them. Maybe it was just a bad day. Maybe it was something darker. But what he did know, what he felt in his bones, was that this wasn't over. The toy tapped again. LaRon giggled softly, and Corbin leaned forward just enough to mutter, "Better keep that baby quiet, or I will." Jalen's hands clenched in his lap. He didn't speak. He didn't turn. but the heat in his chest rose dangerously close to the surface. Across the aisle, Derek's head slowly turned. His eyes narrowed. He didn't need to hear the words. He saw the aftermath in his son's clenched jaw and his shoulders pulled tight. This was no longer about a toy. This was about control, intimidation, and the fact that, for reasons unknown, Corbin Hale had chosen a 17-year-old boy and his baby brother as targets of silent hostility. The kind of hostility that builds slowly, like pressure behind a sealed door. Behind them, Corbin adjusted his seat with a sharp click. Not reclining, just pressing, testing. Jalen tensed as the back of the chair jerked once, twice before settling again. Then, silence. A long, suffocating silence. And the toy rolled back to Jalen's hand, innocent and small, as if it had never started anything at all. But the silence it returned into was anything but innocent. Jalen kept his head down, his mind racing. This man, this stranger, wasn't just angry. He was waiting for a reason, waiting for something to tip, and Jalen could feel the tipping point creeping closer. From the outside, the cabin looked peaceful. Passengers snoozed under thin blue blankets. Coffee brewed near the galley. The captain's voice occasionally cut in with altitude updates. But in row 14, the rules of peace no longer applied. Derek returned his eyes to the page but didn't read. He was watching, listening, waiting, like Jalen, for whatever came next. None of them spoke. Not yet, but the air between them had changed, and something in the shadows of that morning flight was already beginning to stir. The flight had only just begun, yet the trouble was already unfolding. Corbin's knee thudded sharply into the back of Jalen's seat. The jolt wasn't strong enough to make a scene, but it was deliberate. Jalen blinked, his fingers still gently tapping the small wooden toy in Laron's lap. The soft rhythm meant to keep his baby brother calm. He didn't look back. Not yet. He had promised his father. No incidents this time. No misunderstandings. No giving anyone an excuse. But then came the second tap. Then a third. Each time Corbin's knee pressed into the cushion behind him, it sent a message. I want a reaction. Jalen sat straighter, shoulders tense, eyes forward. The seat wasn't reclined. He knew that. Yet Corbin's mutter followed, low but pointed. You're leaning too far back. Can't breathe here. Jalen didn't reply. Instead, he adjusted the toy in Laron's hand again, tapping its wooden edge lightly against his palm to regain the rhythm. Laron had stopped smiling. His grip loosened. Derek, across the aisle, had noticed everything. Without looking directly, he leaned over and whispered, calm but firm. Breathe. Let it pass. Jalen nodded. He wanted to obey. But the noise behind him didn't stop. Corbin shifted in his seat with exaggerated effort, sighing loudly, muttering indistinct complaints. Noisy families. Babies on early flights. Entitled kids. Yet, when a flight attendant passed, Corbin straightened like a model passenger, offering a smile that made Jalen's stomach turn. Dramatic irony deepened like a shadow stretching across the row. No one outside their bubble could see what was happening inside it. Corbin was too careful, too skilled at hiding hostility behind civility. Jalen knew this type of man. He'd met them in school halls and classrooms. People who knew how to poke and prod until you were the one who snapped. Then came the flick. Corbin's hand appeared for a blink, reaching around the seat with unnatural precision. With one swift motion, he flicked the wooden toy clean out of Jalen's hand. It tumbled into the aisle and landed with a dull clatter against the cabin wall. Laron whimpered. The sound was soft, uncertain, and brief. But to Jalen, it might as well have been a scream. His little brother's lip trembled, eyes darting from the empty space in his lap to Jalen's face, looking for comfort he wasn't sure how to give. Derek's head lifted immediately. The atmosphere changed. Jalen unbuckled and leaned into the aisle to grab the toy. At that exact moment, Corbin kicked his seat again, harder this time, and in rhythm with the movement, so it almost looked like coincidence. Jalen flinched but kept going. He reached for the toy with a clenched jaw and drew it back slowly. "Watch the aisle," Corbin murmured coldly above him. "Some people still have legs." The words struck like ice water down Jalen's spine. He turned slightly, only slightly, locking eyes with the man behind him. Corbin's expression was unreadable, half amusement, half challenge. Jalen sat back into his seat, handed the toy to LaRon with a steady hand, and looked forward again. Derek stood, not loudly, not quickly, but with the kind of silent force that made people turn. His posture was calm, his voice lower than usual. "Keep your feet to yourself," he said. No threat, just fact. A murmur ran through the row. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Corbin said nothing, but the smirk didn't leave his face. His fingers tapped the armrest as if counting down to his next move. The tension didn't just sit between them, it stretched across every seat nearby, invisible but undeniable. The passengers knew something was off, but they didn't know what to do. Flight attendants passed without noticing, or perhaps without wanting to notice. Jalen gripped the armrest with one hand and the toy with the other, his thumb tracing the carved edge of the tiny wooden planet. His heart beat faster. Every lesson his father had ever taught him about restraint echoed in his mind. But restraint had limits. "Kids shouldn't be here," Corbin muttered, just loud enough for Jalen to hear. "If they can't manage themselves—" Jalen's knuckles whitened. The words weren't about LaRon. Not really. They were aimed at him. The man was baiting him, daring him to respond. And in that moment, Jalen didn't feel 17. He felt 10 again, sitting in a principal's office trying to explain why defending his friend meant he got detention. He breathed in, then out. Derek's hand landed gently on his shoulder from across the aisle. No words, just a reminder. You don't answer cruelty with chaos. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them all. Corbin leaned back smugly, his victory not in volume, but in precision. He knew exactly how to dance on the edge of trouble without falling over it. And Jalen, torn between impulse and integrity, knew this wouldn't end here. The passengers nearby sat straighter. Some looked toward the front. A man across the aisle pretended to read his magazine upside down. The storm cloud hadn't broken yet, but it hovered, waiting. And that was when the quiet hostility took its first sharp turn. Corbin's shoe struck Jalen's shin. It wasn't a mistake. The aim was too precise, too timed, too cruel. The sharp thud of the impact echoed subtly beneath the white noise of the cabin, a sound missed by most but felt entirely by the teenager whose breath caught in his throat. Jalen recoiled instinctively, clutching Laren tighter with one hand while the other grabbed the edge of his seat for balance. The baby let out a startled cry as if sensing his brother's pain. But Corbin wasn't done. A second kick followed almost instantly, this one harsher, deliberate, and aimed with the cold confidence of someone who believed he could get away with it. The heel caught Jalen squarely in the side of his calf, forcing his leg to buckle slightly. Jalen gasped, more from disbelief than pain, and snapped his head around to meet the man's eyes. But Corbin was already speaking, his voice rising into a rehearsed outrage. "He blocked the aisle, twice," Corbin said loudly, just as Derek stood up to protect his sons. "Nearly tripped me. This is getting ridiculous." Derek's posture was firm, his body now a human shield between Corbin and the boys. His voice remained controlled but iron-edged. "You kicked my son. Twice." Corbin raised his hands in mock defense, his tone turning slippery. "I nudged him. Barely. If he wasn't crawling into the aisle, we wouldn't be having this problem." The passengers nearby stirred, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked between the two men, others glanced forward waiting for crew intervention. But none spoke. Not yet. Dramatic irony thickened in the air. Those who had witnessed everything remained silent, unsure whether to step in or stay out. Then, from the front of the cabin, the cockpit door clicked and opened. Officer Marin Voss stepped into view, his co-pilot uniform crisp his expression professional but already annoyed. "What's going on back here?" he asked, scanning the row without urgency. Corbin struck quickly like he had practiced. "We've got a situation. That teen's been disruptive, blocking the aisle, kicked me while I tried to move past." Derek opened his mouth to speak, but Marin had already turned to Jalen. "Sir," Marin said sharply, "is that true? Were you blocking the aisle or causing disruption?" Jalen's mouth hung open for a second. "No, I was just picking up my brother's toy. He kicked me." Marin sighed, glancing toward Corbin, who now sat with crossed arms and a mask of victimhood. "Let's not escalate this further. Everyone's tense, but we need cooperation, not complaints." Derek stepped closer, keeping his voice steady. "Officer Voss, I need you to listen. That man kicked my son while he was retrieving a toy. Twice. Unprovoked." Marin raised a hand. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but I need to de-escalate, not arbitrate. We'll review the situation after landing." Jalen's stomach tightened. He could barely process what he was hearing. The officer, who was supposed to ensure safety, had taken one look, listened to one side, and decided who to believe. Corbin leaned back in his seat, smugness flashing in his eyes like a victorious smirk. The toy, a small wooden planet, lay on the carpeted floor between rows, forgotten in the middle of this theater of unfairness. Then came the worst blow yet, not a kick, not a word, but a command. "To prevent further distraction," Marin said, turning to Jalen and pointing at the toy, "we're going to remove the object until the situation settles." "What?" Jalen blinked. "He didn't do anything," Derek said, a note of disbelief finally cracking through his calm. Marin's tone grew firmer. "The cabin must remain controlled. That toy's been a source of disruption. We'll return it after we land." Behind him, a few passengers murmured, now clearly unsettled by what they were seeing. But Marin didn't turn to them. He looked only at Corbin, who offered a fake nod of understanding, as if he were the rational one. Jalen felt a rush of heat build in his chest. His jaw clenched. Every word his father had ever spoken about restraint echoed in his mind, fighting against the urge to lash out. His calf throbbed where Corbin had struck. Leron whimpered softly beside him, cheeks wet with tears, too young to understand betrayal, yet instinctively reacting to the chaos. Derek placed a firm hand on Jalen's shoulder, grounding him again. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Marin stepped forward to collect the toy. That was when Corbin leaned sideways and muttered just loud enough for Derek and Jalen to hear. "Some families don't belong in premium seating." Derek's eyes narrowed. A line had been crossed, but Marin hadn't heard it. He reached down for the toy, unaware of the weight building in Derek's chest. And as the co-pilot's fingers brushed the wooden sphere, the look on Derek Verdun's face shifted, from composed to something else entirely. His hand moved swiftly, not in aggression, but in quiet defiance. He grasped Marin's wrist, not hard, not to hurt, but to stop him. "Don't," Derek said in a low, steady voice. "You're punishing the wrong people." Marin pulled back sharply, his face tightening. The physical contact, however nonviolent, changed everything. From behind, Corbin stood suddenly, raising his hands as if stepping in to defend the crew. "He grabbed him," Corbin said, voice rising. "I told you this family was trouble." The aisle turned into a corridor of heat and pressure. Every eye was now locked on row 14. Some passengers reached for their phones. The whisper of fabric, the beep of seatbelt signs, the hush of breath before a storm, it all mingled into a tension that could no longer be hidden. Jalen saw it unfold like a slow-motion unraveling of trust, justice, and logic. His breath was shallow. His fingers gripped the armrest like it could stop the world from sliding. The toy lay between all of them, now glowing with meaning far beyond its weight. And just as Marin stepped back, expression unreadable, Jalen realized it was no longer just a conflict. It was a test of restraint, of truth, of who would be believed. That was the moment when frustration became something far more dangerous. Marin bent down, fingers reaching for the toy lying near Jalen's foot, and Jalen's stomach twisted. The gesture was clear. He meant to confiscate it, not return it. Jalen's body stiffened as if the toy represented the last ounce of fairness left on this flight. But before he could react, a voice broke through the air like a snapped wire. "Some families don't belong in premium seating." Corbin's voice wasn't loud, but every syllable was loaded with poison. The nearby passengers didn't all hear it, but Derek did. His posture changed instantly. Without hesitation, he reached down and gripped Marin's wrist, not in anger, not to hurt, but firm enough to stop the toy from being taken. The co-pilot froze mid-motion, startled by the contact, and his head jerked upward to meet Derek's eyes. Derek's voice was low but unshakable. "You're not taking the toy. Not when my sons have done nothing wrong." For a second, everything paused. Marin recoiled as if stung, jerking his arm free, his pride flaring in response to what he perceived as a challenge. His face tightened, jaw clenched, and he stepped back quickly, drawing himself upright. "Sir, do not touch crew. I'm maintaining order. If you have concerns, address them after landing," he said, his voice louder now, attracting more attention from passengers whose curiosity had already been piqued. Corbin stood the moment he saw Marin withdraw. He moved like a man auditioning for innocence, lifting his hands halfway and declaring loudly, "Let's all just stay calm." He grabbed the officer first. Jalen saw it unfold like a scene rehearsed. Corbin's eyes gleamed, his performance beginning. Passengers in surrounding rows stirred, turning their heads as the aisle filled with rising tension. Whispers passed like wind between the rows, some passengers filming now with discreet phones angled just above tray tables. Marin's gaze darted between Derek and Corbin. Confusion bloomed across his face. He didn't know who to believe anymore, but his body language betrayed his assumption. He still leaned subtly toward Corbin's version of events. He hadn't seen the toy get kicked, hadn't heard the slurs. He'd only seen Derek's firm grip on his wrist. "I'm going to need you both to return to your seats," Marin said, forcing authority into his voice, but it cracked slightly at the end. The pressure in the cabin thickened, each second stretching like wire drawn too tight. Some passengers looked toward the front of the plane, expecting a flight attendant or someone from the cockpit. No one came yet. Corbin exhaled loudly. "This is what happens when people can't control their kids," he said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Jalen's jaw clenched. His hands tightened into fists at his sides, not out of violence, but because he didn't know where to put the sharp fury twisting in his chest. He felt Laurent's tiny hand clutch his sleeve tighter, whimpering again from the rising noise and movement. Jalen wanted to protect him, to push back, but his father's words still echoed. "Stay composed." Then Corbin took a step forward into the aisle, closing the distance. His stance was theatrical now, arms open, chin slightly lifted, like a man daring someone to act out. "You really want to escalate this?" he said with a smirk. Marin extended a hand between the men like a weak divider. "Let's just," he started. But it was too late. Every man in that aisle had made a choice. Marin had chosen procedural blindness. Corbin had chosen performance and power. Derek had chosen principle. And Jalen, though silent, had chosen endurance. The other passengers now leaned in, not just watching, but recording, judging. Some were angry, some anxious, but no one was indifferent anymore. The atmosphere shifted from silent discomfort to full awareness. In that moment, Jalen realized something terrifying. It wasn't about the toy anymore. It never had been. This was about pride, authority, and who would be believed. And if one more thing went wrong, if one more hand moved too fast or one word came too sharp, the entire flight would plunge into irreversible chaos. And just as Marin tried once more to gesture toward the toy, hesitating, Derek's voice cut clean through the space. "No." Marin froze. Corbin's smirk twitched. Jalen's heart pounded as he glanced around at the aisle, the passengers, the tightening expressions. Everything had become brittle. And with one more mistake, everything was about to explode. Corbin stepped fully into the aisle and shoved Jalen's shoulder with his open palm. The motion was masked in casualness, but the force behind it was deliberate, too sharp to be accidental. Jalen lurched sideways into the armrest, the edge biting into his ribs as he braced himself. Laron, startled by the sudden jolt, burst into tears again, louder this time, his cries sharp and panicked in the tight cabin space. Derek reacted before thought could stop him. In one fluid motion he stood and placed himself directly in front of Jalen and Laron, his stance squared, arms slightly out as if ready to shield both sons from any further harm. His voice came low, firm, without anger, but charged with authority. "Step back," he ordered Corbin, each syllable crisp. Corbin tilted his head, the corners of his mouth twitching in mock confusion. "What's your problem?" he asked, feigning innocence. "The aisle isn't yours." Passengers nearby stirred. Some sat up straighter, some half rose from their seats. A middle-aged man in a navy jacket hesitated with his hand hovering near the call button, unsure whether to press it or wait for the flight crew to act. Whispers rippled down the row, but no one spoke loud enough to take command of the moment. Co-pilot Marin Voss appeared from the galley, stepping into the scene with a clipboard still clutched in one hand. His gaze passed over Derek and Corbin but landed on the latter's calm expression. Corbin, ever the performer, adopted a confused, slightly wounded look and gestured lazily at Derek. "This man just blocked me out of nowhere. He's been confrontational from the start. Ask anyone." Derek tried to respond, but Marin raised his hand without meeting his eyes. "Gentlemen," the co-pilot said tightly, "I need to maintain cabin order. I'll review everything after we land." Marin's dismissal stung. Dramatic irony pressed harder. Those who had seen the events unfold exchanged uncertain looks, but Marin still believed the louder voice over the truthful one. Corbin, emboldened, took another small step forward. His leg twitched upward slightly, not quite a kick, but a disturbing mimicry of one, as if taunting Jalen again. That motion sent Derek stepping forward in a tighter stance, and the tension crackled visibly now, like static before a storm. It was then that the cockpit door opened with a distinct hiss of pressurized release. Captain Roderick Vale emerged, tall and centered, his face etched with focus. The moment he stepped into view, the air seemed to shift. He didn't speak immediately. He just observed. His eyes flicked from Laron's tear-streaked cheeks to Jalen's clenched jaw to Corbin's smirk, then finally to Derek's firm stance. The captain's voice, when it came, was even and calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "What's happening here?" Corbin jumped on the moment, pointing directly at Derek. "That man grabbed a crew member. His son's been blocking the aisle, creating a disturbance." The captain's brow furrowed slightly as he turned to Derek. "Sir, is this true?" Derek's mouth opened to respond, but he hesitated. He knew that even a misinterpreted word could tilt this moment the wrong way. He glanced at Jalen, still cradling the crying Laron, then back at the captain. Before he could speak, Corbin leaned forward again, too close, and jabbed a finger toward Jalen, his voice sharpening with false indignation. "He's been provoking me the whole flight." "Captain," a voice interrupted softly from a few rows back. It wasn't loud, just clear, just enough. Captain Vale turned his head. A man in a charcoal gray shirt had risen halfway from his seat, expression solemn. "I saw what happened," the passenger said. "He kicked the boy. Twice. He kicked the toy. Provoked the entire thing. The father never laid a hand on anyone." There was a pause. Then another man, balding, wearing reading glasses, nodded from the aisle across. "He's right. Co-pilot got it wrong. The teen's been calm this whole time. That guy's been pressing him since takeoff." The words rippled like water through the tension. Captain Vale's shoulders stiffened, his posture subtly altering as new weight settled onto the moment. Corbin's smirk faltered, His eyes darted sideways, calculating. "They're exaggerating," he snapped. "This is a misunderstanding." But the shift had begun. Authority was no longer his to twist. The captain stepped closer to Corbin, voice still measured but edged with finality. "Return to your seat. Now. We'll sort this properly." Corbin opened his mouth, still hoping confidence could erase the consequences, but Vale's gaze didn't waver. And then, like the final beat in a tightening drumroll, Corbin stepped back, not in surrender, but in calculation. And as he moved, something in his body language darkened, just enough to unsettle those watching closely. Jalen's heart pounded, not just from the earlier shove, but from the realization that Corbin wasn't finished. He clutched Laron tighter, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. The cabin lights felt suddenly too bright, every face too focused. The silence that followed wasn't calm, it was thick, expectant, watching. Corbin leaned toward Jalen again, not touching him this time, but pointing as if to single him out for the last word. And that was when the man in the gray shirt whispered something else to the captain, something not meant for others to hear. Captain Vale's eyes widened slightly. His jaw tensed. And, just like that, with a shift so sharp it could be felt rather than heard, everything changed. Everything that followed grew from that single, quiet correction. Captain Vale didn't ask twice. His hand rose, palm facing outward, and the cabin fell quiet as if the air itself froze in response. "Please repeat what you said," the captain instructed, his voice firm but calm, with the weight of command behind it. The man who had spoken, mid-30s, measured and composed, stood slowly. His name was Terran Voss, and his voice cut clearly through the pressurized silence. "I saw everything," Terran said. "The man in row 14C kicked the toy on purpose, twice. He kicked the teenager in the leg. Then again, harder. He tried to provoke them. It wasn't self-defense. It was targeted." Gasps rippled through nearby rows. A second man, older, sitting diagonally behind Corbin, also rose. "He's right," the man said, his voice lower but firm. "The co-pilot made a mistake. That boy and his father have been calm the whole time. I saw the kicking. The insults, too." Captain Vale turned his gaze slowly toward Corbin. For the first time, his professional mask cracked, just slightly, revealing suspicion beneath. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightened, and when he spoke, it wasn't a question. "Remain in your seat," Vale ordered. Corbin shifted in place. "I have the right to stand," he snapped, a fake laugh breaking from his mouth. "I'm allowed to stretch." "You shoved a passenger," Vale responded flatly. "I was defending myself." Vale didn't blink. "Remain. Seated." Corbin's eyes darted left, then right, as if searching for someone who still believed him. None did. Passengers leaned away, phones tucked quietly into hands or held below tray tables. Derek remained still beside Jalen, every muscle in his body ready to move if Corbin tried again. Then, with a flare of arrogance, Corbin made his next mistake. He stepped forward. Captain Vale didn't move at first, only raised one hand to halt him. Corbin ignored it and took another step, then swung his arm outward, not a punch, not even a shove, but a clumsy, dismissive gesture. His hand grazed the captain's jacket. That faint contact hit harder than any strike, not because of the force, but because of the symbol. You do not touch the pilot, not in midair, not during conflict, and not when the cabin is already coiled like a spring. The cabin gasped as one. Marin flinched, his face draining of color. He had misjudged everything. From the first flick of the toy to now, he had stood on the wrong side, and he knew it. Derek's stance hardened, eyes locked on Corbin's every movement. The aisle wasn't wide enough for two men to pass without brushing shoulders, but that wasn't the threat. It was Corbin's eyes, still sharp with defiance, still darting for someone weaker. He looked at Jalen. Jalen, sitting with his baby brother still curled against him, felt the weight of that gaze like a spotlight. Every instinct inside him screamed to rise, to shield, to act. But he didn't move. His father was there. The captain was there. But Corbin stepped again, now angling slightly toward the seat, toward Jaylen, toward the baby still clutching the now fallen toy. Captain Vale blocked him fully, stepping into his path with full authority. "You're done," the captain said. Corbin didn't reply. Instead, in an attempt to bypass, he twisted sharply, trying to sidestep the captain. But his motion was clumsy, his foot catching against the edge of a seat. His elbow came up, accident or not, and struck the captain squarely in the chest. A thud. Audible. Real. Time paused. Passengers didn't breathe. The air seemed to lean inward, as if the cabin itself had inhaled. Jaylen stared, wide-eyed, his muscles locked. The shove, the toy, the kicks, the disbelief. It had all led here. His chest ached, not just from tension, but from the deep, instinctive understanding that something irreversible had just occurred. He looked down briefly at Laron, who whimpered softly, not fully understanding, but sensing the fear around him. And when Jaylen looked back up, the captain hadn't moved an inch, except for his eyes. They had changed, hardened. Corbin, either unaware or unwilling to stop, took one more breath to speak, but that breath was never released, because that accidental contact had broken the last line of restraint, and in its place, something else now gathered. The cabin had turned into a storm, and the next strike was inevitable. The toy shot across the floor in a sharp wooden spin the moment Corbin's heel came down on it. The stomp deliberate and loud enough to draw startled breaths from the nearest row. It skidded under Jaylen's seat, rolling into the shadow beneath his knees. Jaylen reacted instantly, bending forward before Laren could burst into another frightened cry. But in the narrow space of the aisle, Corbin moved faster, too fast for anyone to predict, lunging forward with a sudden violent kick aimed directly at Jaylen's side. The blow struck with a dull, shocking thud. Jaylen gasped as pain tore through his ribs, his body twisting sideways across the seat from the force. The cabin fell silent in a single, collective inhale. Even Captain Vale, who had been stepping toward the conflict, froze for half a heartbeat, his eyes widening in disbelief at what he had just witnessed. Derek reacted before thought could catch up to instinct. He surged forward, placing himself between his sons and Corbin with a protective force that startled nearby passengers. "Enough," Derek said, his voice low, controlled, and trembling with restrained fury. He pushed Corbin back with both hands, not striking him, but creating a barrier that made his role unmistakable. He was shielding his family. Corbin stumbled, then caught himself on the back of a seat. His face twisted, not with fear, but with indignation, as though he believed he still held some claim over the aisle. "Don't touch me," he snapped, shoving blindly toward the nearest form of authority, Captain Vale. The shove barely moved the captain, but it violated a line so absolute that even Corbin seemed not to understand the depth of what he had done. Passengers gasped. A man in row 13 rose halfway out of his seat. Someone hit the call button repeatedly, though the chime felt distant and pointless in the chaos. Marin, the co-pilot, tried to push into the aisle, but Corbin's wild, erratic arm movements kept blocking him. Corbin wasn't fighting with purpose anymore, just flailing with the kind of reckless fury that burned without direction. Jaylen struggled upright, wincing. His ribs ached, but the humiliation stung even more sharply. He clutched the edge of his seat with one hand while the other pulled Laron closer, trying to soothe the baby's escalating cries. The sound sliced through the tension like a siren. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Dramatic irony lingered in the air. Many of them had watched Corbin escalate step after step. Yet Marin had misjudged the situation earlier, and that silent mistake had paved the way to this moment. They understood now that the smallest misread detail on a plane could grow into something dangerously out of control. Jaylen's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he tried to make sense of everything. Part of him wanted to shout, to lash out, to defend himself the way the burning in his chest demanded, but he couldn't. Laurent's cries kept him anchored, reminding him that one wrong move could frighten the baby even more. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay still despite the shaking in his hands. Then Corbin did the unthinkable. He swung his arm toward Jalen again, reckless, furious, and completely ignoring the fact that Captain Vale stood inches away. His fingers sliced through the air, aiming blindly for the teenager he had already hurt. Captain Vale's face hardened instantly, the decision forming even before his body moved. His expression was no longer confused or cautious, it was resolute. He had seen enough. A threat to a minor, to a seated passenger, and now to the captain himself, this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a crisis demanding intervention. "Stand down," Captain Vale ordered, stepping in to restrain Corbin. But Corbin twisted violently, trying to pull away. In that twisting motion, sloppy, uncontrolled, and full of misplaced rage, his elbow shot backward and struck the captain squarely in the chest. The impact wasn't strong, but it was unmistakable. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Marin froze mid-step. Derek's eyes snapped to the captain. Jalen felt the breath leave his lungs, not from pain, but from the realization that everything had just changed. Corbin's eyes widened for a split second, as if he himself understood he had crossed into something far more serious than a shouting match. The aisle fell into a heavy, electric silence. That single blow sealed what would happen next. The passenger smirked, certain his attacks would go unchallenged, unaware that every movement, every second, and every witness had already aligned behind a father figure in the cockpit. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets force, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Corbin's elbow had just grazed the front of the captain's jacket, a blow likely unintentional but definitive enough to break the invisible boundary between authority and threat. The cabin air, already thick with tension, seemed to snap taut. Without hesitation, Vale responded. His right arm shot forward with the precision of someone trained not only in leadership but in defense. His closed fist landed with a sharp crack against Corbin Hale's jaw. The impact was immediate and clean. Corbin's head jerked sideways from the force and his body staggered backward, crashing into the edge of a seat and collapsing onto the floor between rows. The silence that followed was absolute, shattered only by the startled gasp of a nearby passenger and the clatter of a dropped phone. Several passengers ducked instinctively, unsure if more violence was coming. Jalen froze mid-motion, clutching his baby brother tightly, heart hammering against his ribs. Derek's eyes narrowed as he stepped instinctively between his sons and the fallen man, his protective instincts overriding all else. Corbin let out a guttural grunt as he scrambled to sit up, clutching the armrest with both hands, dazed. His mouth hung open, stunned not just by the physical blow, but by the collapse of the control he had wielded until seconds ago. For the first time since he boarded the flight, he looked small. The co-pilot, Marin Voss, stood frozen just past the curtain line near the galley. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. His eyes darted between the captain and the passenger sprawled across the aisle, trying to process what had just happened. He had spent the last 20 minutes defending Corbin's demeanor, assuming Derek was overreacting, that Jalen was simply emotional. Now the weight of those assumptions pulled his face into pale regret. Derek, seeing Corbin start to rise again, stepped forward in synchronization with Captain Vale. His hand pressed against Corbin's shoulder, not roughly but with authority, keeping him in place. "Stay down," Derek said, his voice level but lined with steel. "You've done enough." Corbin opened his mouth, ready to protest, but a chorus of voices rose around him. Multiple passengers began speaking over him, assertively, clearly. He kicked that boy twice. He shoved the captain. He tried to hit the child again. The shift was swift. Where once there had been nervous silence, now there was solidarity. Row after row began contributing fragments of truth that shattered Corbin's carefully constructed lies. The man who had dominated the aisle with smugness and intimidation now found himself surrounded by people who no longer feared him, and who were no longer silent. Jalen watched this unfold from his seat, his chest rising and falling quickly, his side still throbbing from the blow. Leron stirred against him, calmed slightly by the return of silence but still sniffling. The baby's small wooden toy, now resting in Jalen's lap, felt like the eye of a storm that had finally broken loose. The teenage boy gripped it tightly, as if anchoring himself to something solid in a moment that felt surreal. Corbin made one last attempt to rise, pushing against the seat frame beside him. His face twisted between anger and disbelief, still clinging to some notion of control. But Derek didn't move, and neither did the captain. "You assaulted a passenger," Vale said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than if he had shouted. "And you struck the captain of this aircraft." His tone wasn't theatrical. It was grounded, firm, the kind of voice that told everyone listening that the matter was no longer up for debate. "I was provoked," Corbin barked, eyes flashing with desperation. "He grabbed my arm. He shoved me first." Passengers again spoke over him. "Lies. We all saw it. You kicked that teenager like it was normal." The din of voices became a barrier, isolating Corbin in a way far more effective than any physical restraint. The cabin no longer belonged to him. His dominance, once bolstered by a silence he assumed meant approval, had evaporated under the weight of collective truth. Captain Vale nodded once toward the co-pilot, who was still standing by like a man waking from a dream. "Marin," he said, never taking his eyes off Corbin, "we need restraints. Now." The co-pilot blinked, then moved quickly toward the storage compartment near the service area, retrieving the restraint straps kept for emergencies. As he passed Derek, he muttered under his breath, "I'm sorry. I didn't see it right." Derek didn't answer. His focus remained on Corbin, whose shoulders now slumped in defeat. The once defiant passenger no longer raised his voice, no longer met anyone's gaze. Instead, he sat heavily where he had fallen, staring into the middle distance as though trying to figure out how his carefully orchestrated manipulation had collapsed in seconds. Jalen exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. His limbs were stiff, his breathing shallow, but something deep inside him felt steadier. He looked at his father with a silent question. What happens now? Derek, as always, met the moment with quiet certainty. He gave a single nod as if to say, "It's not over, but we're not alone." Marin returned and began fastening the straps over Corbin's arms with mechanical movements, each loop silent, each pull final. A few more passengers shifted back into their seats, cautiously glancing around as if expecting another twist. But for the moment, the aisle was quiet, still heavy with tension, but no longer ruled by fear. And yet, Captain Vale's expression never softened. His jaw remained tight, his eyes watchful. Striking a passenger, even one as violent as Corbin, was no small matter. There would be questions, reviews, headlines perhaps, but looking down at Corbin, slouched and bound, he felt no regret, only resolve. In seat 14B, Jalen reached for his brother's hand and gripped it gently, still holding the toy in his lap. He didn't know what the next few hours would bring, but for now, the storm had cracked open, and the man who had sparked it lay quiet. And with the captain's fist, the entire direction of the story changed. Corbin Hale slumped in his seat, his arms pinned by the restraint belt Marin Voss had just finished tightening. The belt clicked shut with a firm snap that echoed louder than expected in the now tense cabin. Though Corbin still muttered complaints under his breath about legal rights, discrimination, and overreactions, his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Captain Vale stood nearby, his jaw tense, watching for any sign of another outburst. Marin stepped back, his face pale with shame. Every action he took now carried the silent weight of regret. Derek leaned toward his son, brushing aside the fabric of Jalen's shirt to check the area where Corbin's kick had landed. He moved carefully, as if afraid that pressure alone might reopen some invisible wound. "I'm fine," Jalen said softly, but his voice was tight. He inhaled sharply as Derek's palm hovered near the bruised rib. Just sore. Derek nodded, not pressing further. You stayed calm. I'm proud of you. The words barely sank in before LaRon, seated beside Jalen, reached for the tiny wooden toy that had caused so much chaos. It had rolled near Corbin again during the scuffle, but had been kicked back by a helpful passenger once the fight ended. Jalen passed it over gently. The moment LaRon wrapped his small fingers around it, his cries stopped like a switch had been flipped. The silence was startling. All around them, passengers breathed out slowly, some still clutching armrests, others blinking in stunned reflection. A man in the back whispered, "It was over a toy," to no one in particular. Another passenger rubbed his temple and muttered, "I almost got up. I should have earlier." The toy, small, harmless, seemingly insignificant, had somehow carried the weight of everything. Captain Vale turned toward the front of the cabin and took the intercom phone from its panel. His voice, when it came through the speakers, was calm but resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to an onboard disturbance involving passenger safety, we are diverting to Relisar Field for an unscheduled landing. We will be on the ground shortly. Please remain in your seats, and thank you for your cooperation." The announcement drew a fresh wave of murmurs. A few passengers clapped softly. Others nodded, grateful that the flight would end sooner than expected. Corbin, restrained and fuming, twisted against the belt and sneered toward Jalen. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I'm the one who got attacked. I was trying to move to the restroom." "You kicked a teenager," someone snapped back from across the aisle. Corbin turned but couldn't see who had spoken. He tried to argue, raising his voice louder, but it didn't carry the same effect as before. The cabin no longer accepted his version of events. He was alone now, restrained, exposed, and unraveling. In the cockpit, the co-pilot contacted ground control while Captain Vale stepped quietly into the aisle. His eyes scanned the passengers, taking stock of their condition and demeanor. He paused near Derek and Jalen, then crouched beside their row with a controlled quietness. "Mr. Verdun," the captain said, voice low, "I'll need you and your son to stay behind once we land." Derek looked up. "Of course. Is there something else we need to prepare for?" Vale's eyes flicked briefly toward Corbin, then back to Derek. "Possibly. There's something about Mr. Hale that doesn't sit right. Something I didn't mention earlier because I wasn't sure." Jalen, still holding LaRon, leaned closer to listen. His face was pale, but his focus sharp. "What do you mean?" Derek asked, narrowing his gaze. Captain Vale hesitated, then added, "Let's just say I've seen that name before. Not on a no-fly list, but something quieter, discreet. He was flagged after an incident on a private charter. Nothing ever followed up officially, but something told me to keep an eye on him." Derek straightened slightly. "And now?" Vale exhaled. "Now I think I should have warned you earlier. I didn't expect it to escalate this fast." Around them, passengers were starting to open messenger apps, some typing out what had happened. A man across the aisle was quietly recounting the events to someone on a video call. Another wrote on a notepad, sketching the sequence of actions with dates and names. The flight wasn't just ending. It was evolving into evidence. Jalen turned the wooden toy in his hand, staring at the way the grooves caught the light. "He could have really hurt someone," he said, his voice distant. "He wanted to." Vale nodded slowly, then rose to full height. "I won't let this vanish into a report no one reads." Corbin, still struggling in his seat, barked, "I'll sue this airline into the ground. You'll all see." No one looked at him. The plane began its descent. The hum of the engines lowered. Outside the windows, the open fields of Relisar came into view, a soft patch of emergency landing space wrapped in forest and still morning fog. The emergency lights flickered briefly, then stabilized. Derek reached across the aisle and buckled himself in, eyes never leaving the restrained man a few rows ahead. Jalen tightened his arms around LaRon, shielding him from the last tremors of the descent. Beside them, a silent understanding passed between father and son. This was not over, not by a long shot. The emergency landing would reveal truths none of them expected. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt, and the cabin jolted forward in silence. The emergency landing at Relisar Field had not been scheduled, but it now carried the weight of something necessary. Even before the seatbelt sign turned off, the sound of rushing boots approached from the terminal tunnel. The aircraft's doors were unlocked from outside, and within moments, emergency personnel stepped aboard, uniforms pressed, expressions alert. Corbin Hale, still restrained to his seat by a gray restraint belt looped tightly across his chest and wrists, didn't stop yelling. "This is unlawful detainment," he barked, voice hoarse from shouting. "I'll have every one of you investigated for misconduct. This is discrimination. I want my attorney now." But his words didn't cut through the silence the way they had earlier. His voice sounded different now, thinner, almost desperate. Not even the passengers turned to look anymore. Instead, they watched Derek, Jalen, and the sleeping form of baby Leron with quiet sympathy. Captain Vale stood near the front galley, arms crossed. The line of his jaw was tight, his focus laser-sharp. With a curt nod, he signaled the lead officer. "Seat 14C, he said calmly. "He's restrained. No injuries, just noise." Two officers moved swiftly. One placed a firm hand on Corbin's shoulder while the other began unbuckling the restraint. "Sir, you'll exit the aircraft now," the officer said flatly. "I haven't even—" "This is abuse," Corbin protested, but his legs shook as he stood. Whatever power he had felt during the flight had evaporated. His wrists, red from the friction of struggling, trembled slightly as he was guided down the aisle. He looked around for allies, but no one returned his gaze. Derek sat still, his shoulders squared, Leron now sleeping against his chest. Jalen watched as Corbin passed them, resisting the urge to say anything. He didn't need to. Silence was louder. Once Corbin had been removed from the aircraft, several passengers stood without being asked, approaching the flight attendants and offering to write statements. "I'll email it now if needed," one man said, holding up his phone. "My footage caught most of it." A woman nodded, standing beside him. "He kicked that boy. Twice. He needs to be banned from flying." Marin Voss approached Derek slowly, his steps hesitant, like someone approaching a wounded animal they had once misjudged. His face had lost its earlier authority. Now it held only regret. "I owe you both an apology," he said, voice low, his eyes flickering between Derek and Jalen. "I made a serious error. I believed the wrong person." Derek regarded him with a steady look. Not angry, just resolute. "You did," he said simply. Marin lowered his gaze, nodding. Captain Vale stepped closer. "Mr. Verdun," he said, his tone professional but weighted. "May I speak with you for a moment? Privately." Derek nodded and handed Laren to Jalen, who gently repositioned the toy in his brother's arms. As they stepped toward the narrow galley corridor near the cockpit, the cabin settled into a tense murmur. Inside the confined space, with the hum of the auxiliary engines vibrating faintly under their feet, Captain Vale leaned slightly closer. His voice dropped. "There's something you should know," he said. "Corbin Hale's name appeared this morning on our internal discretionary observation list." Derek frowned. "What kind of list?" "It's not an official no-fly list," Vale clarified. "It's internal, quiet, used for individuals who've had multiple complaints, not enough to block boarding, but enough for us to be told to keep an eye on them. Hale was flagged for escalating behavior during chartered travel." Derek's brow furrowed. "Why wasn't he stopped before?" "Because it doesn't trigger a hard protocol," the captain said, "and we weren't sure if it was credible. He had a settlement filed after an altercation on a private regional jet, paid it off, and it vanished from most logs." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I planned to observe quietly. If I had known it would go this far, I would have intervened sooner." Jalen had been lingering a few steps back but was close enough to hear. His eyes, wide with understanding, met his father's. The realization dawned between them, and this hadn't been random. It hadn't just been a bad man having a bad day. It had been a pattern. One no one had stopped in time. Derek glanced back toward the cabin, where Laurent now slept peacefully again. His fingers curled around the wooden toy that had started it all. "What now?" he asked, his voice level. Captain Vale's gaze was steady. "What comes next," he replied, "is making sure this never happens again." The moment the door clicked shut behind them, Derek Verdun's instincts sharpened. The sterile scent of the private debriefing room barely masked the tension already thick in the air. White walls, a humming overhead light, and a single observation mirror gave the room an interrogation-like feel, though the chairs were cushioned enough to pretend otherwise. Jalen winced as he adjusted the ice pack against his ribs, while baby Laron, now half asleep in his arms, clutched the small wooden planet like it was the only stable thing left in the world. Derek stood tall, jaw clenched, arms crossed, not in aggression, but in readiness. Aviation Security Officer Elric Dorn entered moments later, trim and tight-lipped, wearing the kind of uniform that suggested he spent more time behind locked doors than on airport floors. He carried a silver clipboard and a small tablet, nodding briefly as if to say he understood more than he could show. Without fanfare, he set the items down and looked straight at Derek. "I won't waste your time," Dorn began, his voice level, almost weary. "We've received urgent communications from the tower and cross-departmental briefings within the last half hour. Mr. Hale, Corbin Hale, has a record." Derek didn't move. His eyes narrowed slightly, the only visible shift. "A sealed record," Dorn clarified, "not accessible through normal security screening. Technically flagged, but only through internal markers, ones that never trigger hard alerts." Jalen lifted his head. Then why was he on the plane? His voice cracked slightly, hoarse from the earlier shouting. Dorn's shoulders dropped a little. "Because those flags are discretionary, internal discretion. Hale's prior incidents happened at smaller airstrips and private travel hubs, almost all handled through non-disclosure settlements. No criminal convictions, no official blacklists. Just shadows." Derek stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "So, people knew, and they still let him board?" "Yes." Dorn didn't flinch. "There's a trail of reports. Most are coded under behavior reviews, not legal action. That's how it was kept quiet. This time, it escalated beyond what any of those earlier documents ever described." The weight of dramatic irony settled heavily across the room. The system meant to ensure passenger safety had hesitated, not out of incompetence, but out of self-protective caution. In doing so, it had left the Verdun family exposed. Derek turned slightly, his eyes falling on Jalen, who looked back with a tired but burning sense of justice. Then he glanced down at Laron, whose peaceful face was marked faintly by dried tears. The smallest one on the flight had been caught in the center of a preventable storm. Derek's voice grew sharper, but he kept his tone controlled. "How many people have to be harmed before the system acts?" Dorn didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back to the table and retrieved a folder. Inside was a crisp, official-looking form, marked with a bold blue seal at the top. Precedent brief, civil inquiry waiver. "This is a formal invitation," Dorn explained, sliding it across the table. "You're being asked to testify in a special board review regarding Heirloom Air's mid-flight threat response protocols. Your account could change how these risk flags are handled in the future." Derek studied the form without touching it. "So, you want my name on a policy?" "No," Dorn replied. "We want your experience to prevent the next oversight." A moment passed. Derek exhaled slowly. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't try to become the face of anything." "No one ever does," Dorn said, voice quieter now. "But people listen to those who survived what others ignored." Jalen shifted in his chair and looked directly at the officer. Why does someone like that still get to fly? The question wasn't rhetorical. His voice carried the quiet outrage of someone who had just watched responsibility dodge accountability over and over again. Dorn opened his mouth, then closed it. There were answers, bureaucratic ones, legal ones, but none that could withstand the weight of what had happened. Instead, he lowered his gaze briefly and then tapped the folder. Derek finally picked it up. He flipped through the brief, procedures, witness documentation templates, legal waivers, scheduling timelines. It was formal, overwhelming in its scope, but one section stood out. Recommendation for testimonial contribution to Passenger Risk Assessment Reform Panel. He looked at his sons again. Jalen's bruised ribs, Laurent's tightened grip on the toy, the confusion in both their eyes. This wasn't just about one man on one plane anymore. Derek lowered the file and nodded slowly. "We'll testify," he said, voice resolute. "This can't be buried again." The tribunal room was silent when Derek Verdun stepped forward. No introductions, no warm greetings. Just the quiet shuffling of chairs and the clipped sound of his shoes against the polished floor as he stood before the panel. A large screen behind the board remained dark, and a single mic sat on the table before him. Behind him sat Jalen, a fresh bruise along his ribs beneath his pressed shirt, and Captain Roderick Vale, hands folded tightly in his lap. The review was closed-door, hosted in a secured wing of the Velmark Transit Authority headquarters. Only the airline's internal board and 2 representatives from the National Transport Safety Commission were present. Derek inhaled slowly, then spoke. "My name is Derek Verdun. I was seated in row 14, across the aisle from my sons, Jalen, age 17, and Laurent, who is 9 months old. What occurred aboard Heirloom Flight 907 was not just a case of passenger misconduct. It was a test of every layer meant to protect civilians mid-air, and it failed." His voice didn't rise. He didn't need it to. Every word cut with the weight of someone who had held back until it mattered most. One board member, a stern man with a thin mustache named Oren Geller, leaned forward, studying Derek. "Please walk us through the incident, Mr. Verdun, as clearly as you can." Derek nodded once. "It began with a toy, a small wooden planet that belonged to my youngest. When it rolled into the aisle and was kicked across the cabin by a man named Corbin Hale, we believed it was thoughtless, but it quickly became deliberate, aggressive. His tone never turned dramatic. Instead, it landed like fact, undeniable, steady, inarguable. The room held still. Jalen was called next. His hands trembled as he approached the microphone, but he refused to sit. His eyes darted briefly toward the board, then settled on the center of the table. "He kicked my brother's toy. Then he kicked me," Jalen said, voice low but unwavering. "I tried not to react. I did everything my father told me to do. I stayed calm. But it didn't matter. The co-pilot thought I was the problem. I was just trying to keep Laurent calm." A long pause filled the room. The chairwoman of the airline board, an older woman named Holland Merrick, adjusted her glasses. "Did you feel protected by the crew at any point?" Jalen hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not until Captain Vale came out of the cockpit." Marin Voss, the co-pilot, was already seated in the corner, looking smaller than his uniform allowed. When called forward, he stood stiffly and faced the room without defense. "I misjudged the situation," Marin admitted. "I prioritized order over truth. I relied on tone instead of facts, and it nearly caused real harm. That was my error." His words echoed heavily, and the board took notes in silence. Captain Vale stepped up last. His voice was different than the others, measured, military-like even. But there was a tired sincerity behind it. "I struck Corbin Hale to prevent further harm. He had kicked a teenager, shoved crew members, and raised his hand in a confined aircraft. I waited until I believed no verbal de-escalation would work. It was not personal. It was procedural. It was necessary. One board member scribbled fiercely as Vale spoke, but none interrupted. After the testimonies, the room entered deliberation. An hour passed. Then 2. In the waiting room outside, Jalen leaned into Derek's shoulder, holding the small toy in both hands. It had been returned earlier in a sealed evidence bag, cleaned but scratched along one side, still shaped like a planet, still his. "You think they'll actually do something?" Jalen asked softly. Derek didn't answer immediately. He was watching the door, watching for the future to open or close. The door finally creaked open, and all 3 were ushered back into the room. Chairwoman Merrick cleared her throat. After reviewing witness statements, internal flight recordings, and officer reports, she began, "We have reached the following conclusions." A pause. Captain Vale will not face disciplinary action. His conduct is hereby recorded as measured physical intervention under acute threat. Co-pilot Maren Voss has volunteered for and will undergo retraining protocols, specifically in bias and situational de-escalation. We accept this and commend his accountability. Maren gave a short nod, eyes low. As for policy, Heirloom Air will immediately begin implementing a new passenger behavioral escalation response framework, PBERF, designed in part after Mr. Verdun's example of restraint and clarity under pressure. Corbin Hale's flying privileges are permanently revoked. The room remained still. Then Merrick gestured to an assistant, who stepped forward with a clear envelope. Inside it sat the wooden toy. "We are returning this," she said gently, handing it to Jalen. "It may seem small, but it's a reminder that a simple object can sometimes reveal the fault lines beneath a system." Jalen accepted the envelope, his fingers trembling as he pulled it close. The board chair leaned forward. Her voice softened. Sometimes policy must be rewritten by those who endured what the old one failed to prevent. Jalen held the toy tight, not because of the object, but because of what it now represented. And for the first time, the weight of injustice felt lighter. The students sat in silence, not because they were told to, but because something about the boy standing in front of them, tall, composed, and quietly intense, commanded it. Jalen Verdun gripped the edge of the wooden podium in the auditorium of Marinth Secondary, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. He didn't start with a joke or a quote. He began with the moment that had haunted him and shaped him. "He kicked my baby brother's toy," Jalen said, his voice clear but steady. "And I thought that would be the worst part of the flight." A few students blinked, unsure whether to laugh or frown. Jalen didn't smile. He raised his hand, thumb brushing against the curve of a small wooden planet resting in his pocket. But it got worse, because when you speak up for someone smaller than you, someone who can't fight back, not everyone will believe you. Sometimes they believe the louder voice, or the older one, or the one who pretends better. His fingers relaxed from the podium as he stepped forward. "But that doesn't mean you stop." From the back of the room, a teacher, Mr. Hensley, tall and gray-haired, watched with folded arms and glistening eyes. Jalen's story had spread through town already, but hearing it from the teen himself changed everything. There was no dramatization in Jalen's words, only clarity, and that made it impossible to look away. After the talk, a few younger boys approached shyly. One handed Jalen a folded note. Another just nodded, eyes wide. Jalen thanked them, placed the planet back in his jacket, and walked outside into the crisp Marinth afternoon. Halfway across the city, Derek Verdun adjusted his tie in front of a conference screen. He wasn't one for long speeches or bureaucratic slides, but the board of directors from Ilaran Aviation Group was listening. These were safety officers, route designers, and security chiefs, all gathered to hear from a man who had once stood between a violent passenger and his children without throwing a single punch. Derek clicked to the next slide. "This isn't about just knowing who's dangerous. It's about knowing who's ignored," he said. We're redesigning threat escalation training to focus on patterns, not just incidents. We can't wait for someone to throw a punch to act. One officer raised his hand. What made you step in when the flight crew hesitated? Derek paused. Because I knew if I didn't, my sons would carry the cost, and I won't allow that. The room fell quiet. One by one, the executives nodded. Back in the Capitol, Captain Roderick Vale stepped into a hangar housing the refitted Airaloon 907. Its exterior gleamed under maintenance lights, but his eyes moved toward something more subtle, a freshly installed plaque just inside the boarding door. He'd reviewed dozens of in-flight protocols over the past months, revising every clause that once left ambiguity in crew response. He wasn't just shaping flight manuals anymore. He was building what he called defensive empathy into decision-making. A technician walked by and gave him a respectful nod. They say you're the guy who punched a passenger mid-flight. Vale didn't smile. They should say I was the one who waited too long to do the right thing. Elsewhere, Marin Voss stood on a training stage at a ground operations center, surrounded by recruits. He clicked a remote, and a replay simulation of the Airaloon incident played on screen, minus the audio, but every posture, every misstep preserved. He let the silence stretch after the scene where he sided with the wrong man. I'm not here because I did everything right, he said. I'm here because I didn't, and I want to make sure you don't repeat my mistakes. A hand rose. Why didn't you believe the father at first? Marin met the young trainee's eyes. Because I was trained to look for threats, not truths, and I've learned the two don't always look the same. As for Corbin Hale, his name vanished from every manifest. No more bookings, no more second chances. The settlements that once shielded his past misconduct had been revoked under new transparency laws following the Verdan testimony. He was no longer a threat to any child, not because someone forgave him, but because the system finally recognized the cost of silence. That same day, back in Marinth, Jalen helped Laron into his booster seat. The boy was older now, still clinging to his wooden planet like it was part of his hand. As they pulled into the terminal parking lot for a short domestic flight, Jalen whispered, "Keep it safe, little brother." Derek joined them a moment later, his eyes drawn to the plane outside the window. A familiar curve to its tail, a familiar gate number, a familiar aircraft, Airaloon 907. They boarded quietly, without ceremony. But as they stepped through the jet bridge, Derek slowed. Just inside the doorway, polished and brass-toned, was the plaque. Jalen leaned in to read it with quiet pride. This aircraft adheres to the Verdan Integrity Standard in honor of those who protected without permission. He looked down at Laron, who blinked up at him curiously. And all because someone chose to defend what looked like just a toy, but carried the weight of justice. In moments, the pilot's fist landed, freezing the attacker, and the cabin went silent in shock. The baby and teen were safe, and the arrogant passenger faced instant accountability. If you believe real authority acts with precision, decisiveness, and unstoppable power, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, disrespect, and the courage it takes to stand up against wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.